Today, I'm super excited to be joined by four experts: Dr. Lori Orley Marabankin, Lori Heffelfinger, Sally Braley Parker, and Lacey Leon McLaughlin. Thank you all for being here. We'll talk about the secret sauce for transformational change and the book by the same title, which all these panelists have contributed to in collaboration with my good friend and colleague of over 20 years, an HR thought leader, Ian Ziskin. But before we get into the meat of this conversation, let's make sure you're familiar with some logistics. I think we all are to some extent these days, but we do use the Zoom webinar tool, which many of you are familiar with it already. And this is an interactive webinar. So please note the chat function to provide your comments. And also we welcome questions throughout the webinar. We have one of my colleagues at our office, Dr. Tiffany Ingram, who will be moderating the questions in real time and chiming in as needed. So thanks in advance, Tiffany. We'll answer as many questions as we can, throughout as we can, but also at the end and afterwards if needed. So as long as you provide your email address, we can answer your questions. Please also note that this session is being recorded and it will be available after the webinar on our events page. We have OurOffice.io/events. Last but not least, this webinar is approved for SHRM and HRCI recertification credits. So please stay on because the codes will be provided at the end. So with that, I just want to share this is what we're going to show at the end. So again, welcome everyone. I'd like to start with each of our awesome panel members introducing yourself. Please just give your name, your organization, and also your personal experience that propelled you to want to be part of this book and in connection with transformational change. So we'll start with Lacey.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Lacey Leon McLaughlin. I'm an executive coach and consultant, spending time working with individuals and leaders on things like transformational change. I founded Business Insight Group and the Consortium for Change with Ian Ziskin, who is the mastermind behind this great book. And ultimately, when the book was coming together, there was no way that I was going to not be part of it as something that I knew was going to be amazing. I knew was going to be an awesome collaboration between really great minds that was going to help the HR and business world move forward.
Thank you so much, Lacey. It's awesome to have you. Lori, would you like to go next?
Lori Heffelfinger of the Heffelfinger Company, and my business focuses on mid-market and Fortune 100s, helping individuals, teams, and organizations get to the heart of issues that positively impact relationships, productivity, and the bottom line. And I chose to be part of this book, one with my co-author, Sally, to collaborate and share some thoughts on change, but really to be part of this consortium and the collaboration. So much easier to publish with colleagues. Cool colleagues, I might add, too.
Yeah, and the result is awesome because of the collaboration, right? And we'll talk about that in a moment. But Orly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. So I'm an executive coach, and I'm also the president of a company that I founded, Edge Consulting. It's a company that specializes in helping senior leaders and teams create a systemic change and also thrive in today's VUCA world that is so uncertain and ambiguous. So build the skills to really thrive in that world. My experience with transformational change was an executive leader myself as a part of a company that grew to global acquisitions to become a global player. And also as an external consultant working with a wide range of companies like Lori, from Fortune 100 to small and middle-sized businesses. So thank you again for having me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for taking the time. And last but not least, any means, Sally, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Sonya. And my week is made. I've been called cool, so I like that. I work with mid-sized organizations, leaders, teams, all sectors, and focus really on helping set strategic direction and then making sure that the organization is actually designed in a way that can carry forward that direction. And then also developing adaptive capacity and change muscle. So for me, my work is organization transformation. And when Lori talked about this book, it was a no-brainer. And I'm just thrilled to be a part of this panel and having been a part of the book. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. And I think, I'll just introduce myself briefly also. I'm Sonya Sepahban. I'm an engineer by training, but don't hold that against me. I'm the CEO of OurOffice, where we help organizations of all sizes build more inclusive workplace cultures with professional expertise, of course, a proven process, and also a platform that helps everyone, leverage technology to accelerate their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. I want to first, show the book so that, this is the book. It's on my LinkedIn. I posted about it before when it first came out a few months ago. And of course, you can provide the details of it as we go through here too. But it's called The Secret Sauce for Leading Transformational Change. And, I have to tell you that this was the only book that I took on my end of the year holiday trip, to a very far corner of the world, where I actually was off the grid for 2 whole weeks in Patagonia. So, that I had to really think hard about what I was going to take, and this was the book, and I was so glad because it was really the perfect book to read on a very long flight, but also for curling up on a sofa and just after a full day's hike and reading. It was just really gripping, and I felt like the book really resonated with me, and I wanted to share it with the community because it really provides experiences from about almost 24 experts like our panelists who have really lived the transformation, and they've lived it from different perspectives. So if you want one book to read about transformation, I think, frankly, at least as of today, this is the one that I would recommend very highly. The central theme, well, there are several major themes, and we'll talk about that throughout this conversation. But the one that I personally wanted to share as we kick off the conversation here is that change is personal. And as such, leaders need to both feel the need and act personally to make especially transformational change and to make it effective. But they also need to think of ways that they can make it personal to their team members so that they can really feel it. They understand the reason and they take personal action towards it. Of course, this makes sense to all of us, right? It's not like a lot of important things in life, once you say it, everybody goes, well, sure. But I remember experiences, when it didn't occur to me up front, right? I remember when I was asked to lead DEI at a major corporation as a second hat. Of course, I had my regular P&L role, and then it was a large organization, several thousand employees, of course, and it wasn't until I started really having conversations with my team members around my own personal actions and sharing my own unconscious biases that I had discovered along the way, and really my vulnerability when I found myself in difficult conversations or situations. It was only when I started doing that, and it was several months into this process, that I started to see some engagement and some. So I think we might have an open mic there, but anyway, I just wanted to share that because it wasn't obvious to me when I started. And believe me, I was made very clear to me by the CEO that this was very important. I needed to take this assignment very seriously. Our focus on DEI at that time was driven by a need for really being and also changing our brand to be more innovative. So it really came from a reason of innovation. So we wanted diversity, we wanted inclusion. And we had tried, we had hired people from all kinds of backgrounds, but it was hard to keep them, and it was hard to keep them engaged. So then, this initiative was born, and I was asked to lead it because I think they looked around and I was the only one that looked a little diverse. Usually, get this, when you get it as a second hat, it's like you look the part. And frankly, I had no background. So I'm humbled by all our panelists who have many years of experience in HR and related topics. I came to it new was 2009. I was at it until 2016. And frankly, I was looking for transformational change, and I think we only succeeded partially. I don't think we succeeded fully. And again, two main reasons. One is we couldn't really feel people, and the place didn't feel that inclusive, and it was better, but it wasn't all the way there. And then the second evidence that we didn't fully achieve our objectives is that after I left in 2016, within a few months, I was getting calls from my colleagues, from my team members, from my boss, talking about how things were unraveling, and it wasn't because anyone was not supporting it or wanting to unravel it. So transformational change is really hard. We talk about it a lot. And today in 2023, at a time where really you think 3 to 4 days back, 4 years back, and when I think of it, I was just talking about it with a friend earlier this week. A lot of my own values or things I thought were important or the way I thought things worked have been upended. The future of work is certainly now here, and it's going to be different, right? As we look ahead, even now, and then looking ahead another 3 to 10 years, it's going to be very different. So it's very important that we think of this, the importance of transformational change, what change we need, and what we're going to talk about it. So with that, we'll talk more about this and other themes that, of course, our panelists will bring up. But first, I wanted to start with a really good question that the book poses very early on. And what it asks is transformational change typically driven by a specific need, or does it happen when it's simply inevitable? You find yourself in a situation where there's no other way but to make a change. So I want to ask our panelists, what do you all think about this? Are there any real life examples that you'd like to share? And I think on this one, maybe we'll start with Lori.
Okay. Well, I believe that change can be driven by a specific need, and it's also inevitable. I think if we're paying attention, that is, right, change is inevitable. But not all change is transformational. I think, Sonya, you shared a really good example of that. And Ian states in his book that most of us, individual teams and organizations, would prefer the status quo. So, but in this book, we're really talking about transformational change, which I think is more intentional. It's a radical shift to our businesses. So I think most of us adapted and reinvented in 2020, 2021. And we might think that was transformational change. And I think for some businesses, it was. I think for other businesses, they're looking to go back to pre-2020 ways of working. But so I do have an example of a company I think that is demonstrating transformational change, and it's a large food distributor. Prior to 2020, they were transforming their business, running from having many divisions of kind of homegrown companies to having fewer regions and divisions and being more centrally managed to take advantage of economies of scale, distribution, warehousing, and technology. And then in 2020, because of the business they were in, their business dropped about 40%, but they didn't give up. They hired their clients, warehouse workers, and they started, instead of distributing to warehouses or to restaurants, distributed to grocery stores, because that's where we were all getting our food. But this business, now they're doing okay, but they haven't given up. They're the leader in their industry, but they're still not giving up. They know change is inevitable, but they're staying on top of changes in technology, employee engagement, customer buying patterns, and they're continuing to transform their business. Because if they don't, their competitors will. So I think that's an example of transformative change.
Yeah, that's an industry that really had to go through a lot of change, like back and forth. And now people can't wait to go, of course, to restaurants again. Everybody's going to restaurants. But I think that's a really good example. It's like the book says, right? The more things stay the same, the more they need to change. And I used to say to my teams, if you're not changing, if you're not thinking about the change, then even if you're doing well, you're either, without really knowing it, you're either staying in the same place and your competitors, are doing things right meanwhile, or you're falling behind and you're just not aware of it. So it is, especially, today, again, and with all the changes that have occurred, if you're not changing, that you have to ask yourself, right? Even if you're not an industry that's hugely impacted yet by, directly by the pandemic and all the other uncertainties. So that was really good. Thank you for that. And Sally, would you like to add to that a little bit?
I would love to. I think it's a great question. And I'm right with Lori on it. To me, it's always initiated by some sort of change, or at least a perceived sense of a need to change. And it's inevitable if we want to evolve, if we want to be able to survive and thrive. And why? And I think, Sonya, you mentioned it, our environment is always changing. And at some point, it will have changed to such an extent that our current way of being, the way we're designed, just doesn't work. It's not sustainable. And I think about the transformation that's being driven now by our need for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Yeah, there are still people that are putting their heads in the sand around that, but the rules of the game have changed. And consequently, the system is transforming. And which brings me to something else. And again, I think, Sonya, you mentioned this, that one of the things that distinguishes transformational change for me is that it's systemic. It impacts the entirety of the system, whether it's us as individuals or our organizations. And Ian has a great definition. I think I almost have it memorized that really speaks to this nature of it being systemic, and that transformational change is completely rethinking and repositioning the what, why, how, where, and when associated with dramatically improving effectiveness, happiness, health, survival of someone or something. So for me, that's really talking about something that's systemic. And it's not the result of one thing, one major action. I think sometimes we think it is. And for me, all I need to do is think about the transformation from a caterpillar to a butterfly. All these little steps, and a lot of them we can't see. But ultimately, there's a state change. And we see a butterfly, you could consider it a tipping point. I see transformation as being multidimensional. It's not linear. And this is hit on in the book. It includes past, present, and really requires us to get clear about what do we want to conserve and carry forward? What do we need to let go of? And what new do we need to grow? And an example for me, I think we can look at ourselves, our own journeys as professionals and leaders. I know I think back on all the professional development that I've done, all the work I've done on myself. I think about the questions, what do I carry forward? What do I let go of? And what is it that I'm needing to grow? And there was a point where I felt like suddenly I had transformed into a new and more effective being. And to me, I think that's a great example of transformation.
I love that example. And we should, through this conversation, I hope we all share a little bit of how we've changed, over this period, because I think personal change is just another aspect of it, right? There's the personal, the organizational, they're all the same kind of themes and drivers. I love your imagery of the butterfly, it's a favorite for me always. But also I was laughing or smiling when you were talking about some people that are putting their heads in the sand. I'm going to throw something out there. You don't have to bite, but it's, it just happened this week again. I had to write another LinkedIn, comment, which I wrote almost a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, almost now, about Mr. Jamie Dimon, at JP Morgan, and insisting that everyone has to come back to work. I would have thought that after 2 years of data showing that in situations when it's possible, there is a large, percentage of people that prefer that. And there are some that do not, that people like, in his position of leadership would recognize that really the name of the game is flexibility. You can't force everybody to come to the office, nor can you force everybody not to, and you have to somehow find a way to be flexible. Now, I guess for me, I thought, why not? Let's take Jamie on. I don't think he cares what I say. But I think that ultimately time will tell, right? Time will tell. And sometimes it takes a while for a large organization. But this sort of leadership that, in one way, on things in spite of data, is bound to not do well frankly, for his shareholders and for his employees. And so sometimes I think, I'm going to do that silver dollar, on the, if it's possible for me to just put one other voice into the world, I do it, regardless of how it's, the example of, again, you talk, small things that can happen person together, somehow that maybe will accumulate and become a more, an input that people will pay attention to. But no, I really appreciate your answers to that. I think you're right. It is a combination. It's always, it's not one or the other. But but if you wait too long, then you're kind of forced into it, right? I think the difference is to what extent you understand the need and you are more intentional about it. And frankly, you have more an opportunity to drive it in the way that you see fit versus when it becomes inevitable and you kind of like you just have to do what you have to do at that point. I want to switch and talk about some specific themes that some of you have written about in the book. One of those themes that really jumped at me, and again, it relates to this overall, for me, the overarching, making change personal. We see this again as we do the diversity, equity, and inclusion work. The more the leaders will be personal and personally engaged, the better results they get by far. We actually have something that we started seeing in our data in terms of engagement of the employees that we measure all the time. We measure everything, we're a data company basically, and that gives a lot of feedback to the organizations, and then collectively across organizations, with benchmarks and so on. And one of those is what we call the CEO effect. The CEO effect was when we started seeing, large increases or blips, the technical term that we use in the engagement of the employees, when there was even a very small gesture or some level of engagement from the leader, especially the top leader, but really most of the leaders. At first, we thought it was just one organization or a few of them, but then we started seeing it across all organizations. And the thing that's really interesting is when this increase happens, it obviously, over time, it subsides a little bit, it goes down, and over a period of about 2 weeks, we've seen, but it has a tail. So if the engagement was down here and it all of a sudden, was raised by this level of personal message or reaction or something, on the platform by the leader, it comes back down and then it settles at a higher level. So there is a lasting impact that goes on, and we've been watching it now for several years, and it really does continue. So it's really a very important, example of where being personal is so important. And part of it is being personal, but also intentional, as Orly writes about in the book. So I wanted to go to that, Orly, and ask you, when you say, what's your definition of intentional leader? And then what are some examples of when people have or have not been intentional and the impact on the transformation?
Yeah, thank you for that. So first, let's just think about the world that we live in today. We call it the VUCA world, right? It's that volatile world that is uncertain, it's complex, it's ambiguous. Leaders really cannot control the pace of change. They cannot really predict what happens. They cannot really avoid distractions. So for them to operate well in that world, they need to be really deliberate and intentional how they manage themselves. In fact, we say that the more complex the world outside is, the more we need to be clear inside. The more distractions there outside, the more focused we need to be inside. So who are those intentional leaders and what do they do and actually how they act? So what we've observed is that there are probably 3 key themes to intentional leadership. The first one is really knowing the why, having a compelling reason to move forward and act in a way that really is aligned with their values and with their purpose. So really a clear understanding of what's moving them forward. The second thing is self-leadership. They also call it self-mastery. And that's really more important than ever, because again, the only source of stability that we can control over is within us. Cannot really control the outside world. So that self-mastery can show up in many different ways. First one is managing emotions. Self-management and managing emotions are so important because emotions of leaders have a ripple effect on the organization. You walk into a room and subconsciously you immediately notice what is the emotion of the leader. And that really affects all of us. So self-management, the ability to notice and regulate how we feel, it's really very important. And that's something that intentional leaders do very well. And when you do that, you're more able to actually act based on choice rather than react, right? The second thing is that manage the focus, right? Because there are so many distractions around. When you're able to pay attention to what you pay attention to, that helps you focus on what matters most. And for them is really going back to alignment with the purpose, the values. What is the 1, 2, 3 things that are most important to get done in the next, week, month, year. So that enables them to really navigate difficult situations more effectively. And also manage their energy, because there are many energy drainers, right? And so to conserve our energy, that's another very important aspect of self-mastery. So the first one is really, as we said, alignment with purpose. The second thing is self-mastery. The third thing that we've seen international leaders doing is really investing in the growth, really be completely committed and intentional in this world of busyness to invest in their own growth, to seek diverse opinions, really actively solicit feedback, suggestion, feedback, and just input from many different people. And also create a space for others to experiment and try and create that atmosphere of learning and growth for others as well. So those are the 3 key things that we've seen intentional leaders do. And of course, there are all kinds of habits and rituals that intentional leaders do in order to cultivate that. But they need to be, take care of the physical, the sleep and the exercise. They need to build those reflections into the daily routine. So there are all kinds of practices that intentional leaders do in order to be at a peak performance and to be able to create that environment also for people that work for them.
Yeah, no, thank you. I really love this idea that, being intentional, a lot of people think that it comes, from within, right? I mean, being intentional and then doing a bunch of things, but involving others and getting their input, that you emphasize as well is very important. When it comes to examples, Lacey, I can't help but think that you're one of the best people to talk to that. You've both worked with a lot of great leaders, but also you've been a CEO yourself in that role. How do you see that and examples of intentional leader, right? I mean, what does that really look like, right, in a specific situation?
Yeah, so I would say that, and I'm guessing my colleagues on the Zoom would agree, but the last couple of years have been, from an executive coaching perspective, the hardest years to lead, at least in my experience. Leadership has been hard, right? It's been hard. When you take the pandemic, you take the work from home, you take the social context put out into the world, all the things going not in the way we'd want them to, or maybe there are things going particularly in the way that we want them to that are just very different. It's just been hard. So what I've seen over the last couple of years with some of the best leaders is really, when you take Orly's 3 examples, is that emotional regulation, that mastery, recognizing, and I'm thinking of one leader in particular that was faced with huge amounts of change, but recognizing the impacts that we have on the people that work around us, for us, and with us. Lots of opportunity to practice during the pandemic, that is for sure. There's a leader that I was working with that was putting content out into the world from a production perspective. So shows, movies, music, and ultimately how business got done changed. You had to do testing. You couldn't bring actors together in the same room. You couldn't bring people together to plan pre, post, prep when you think about things we watch, things we see, things we hear. And this leader was frazzled. rightfully so, but frazzled, right? How am I going to show up, keep the doors open, continue to meet the agreements that I have with these other organizations in a very real way, but everything has changed on me. And he got there really quickly with the intentionality around how he went through and changed business, meaning, okay, so here's the process and the procedures and the steps we're going to put in place to keep people safe. Here is how we're impacting our pipeline in terms of production from start to finish. And it wasn't having the results that it wanted in a real way, even though the business dynamic was there. Mm. And when I came in and I observed, I was like, this is interesting. You're doing all the right things when we think about transformation, but you're doing it in a way that are freaking people out. I mean, it was that clear. It was that simple, right? So it was he's trying to make change. The change is good from a business context. It works with the business. It's going to help them business move forward. But the messaging, the intentionality, the ability to regulate, the ability to understand how his communication, his requests, his asks were translating and creating an environment where people were reactive, even though the systems and the process were great and allowed them to be proactive. And, so that is a really good example from my perspective of, we're doing all the right things from a business perspective, and it's not working because how I, as a leader, am showing up just isn't aligning with all of the examples that Orly laid out for us so beautifully. The why was clear. The mastery, we were working on it. And the insight and awareness to the impact of that lack of mastery, the emotional regulation, the ability to slow down, the ability to have intentionality. It was really when that changed, when they understand the impact and then worked on the self-development, made all the difference. And what I'll say is that that production company, is still putting really, really good content out into the world. He is leading that change, and he recognizes the impact that he as a leader has on the ability to succeed in a very real way.
Yeah, I really like that example because we are in LA as well as you, and of course it's a movie town, and of course this kind of the production houses and things like that. I mean, it was very evident. There was a lot of news about how difficult it was for them, and really my heart goes out to it. And at a time when people needed content, we were all sitting at home and we needed to watch stuff. And to your point, I think a lot of times it's the how, right? It's not what you say or what you do, but how you do it, how you say it. And I remember this actually has always stuck with me when I was first promoted to an executive role, a vice president, and I was a major company. I was a TRW, and I remember our president said to me, he said, Sonya, do you understand? I was the youngest. I was going to be the youngest, and I think he detected that I might need this counsel. I definitely did, actually. He said, Sonya, from now on, those two little letters in front of your name, VP, you know what it means. And I was kind of like, I knew that I didn't have the answer. I was like, oh, sir, I don't know. And he said, it means you're going to have to be really thoughtful. I guess he could have said intentional about how you communicate. Because he knew I was kind of like, what you see is what you get. And I was always, kind of very, just communicated a lot. I'm extroverted off the charts, I guess. And it was really good counsel over time. I only realized, the importance of that. And I will also share that at that time, that it was a kind of a process for everyone. When you got such a promotion at that time, you kind of got, entered the club, so to speak. They offered that if you wanted to have a coach, it wasn't perceived as being remedial, even though I think for me, it could have also been remedial, but they were just like, would you like a coach, by the way, for this first year of your executive leadership? And I jumped at it and I was like, absolutely. So, and they actually gave me a selection of coaches. I mean, this is really a shout out to those of you who coach, because I think it's really, really important, both for us to seek, coaching for ourselves and throughout our careers, but also for, others that are in our teams, and to detect, when they might need it. And it's not just a one-time, kind of done, you do it one time, right? Because during different stages of your career, you might still need it. And it was just really so important to raise my awareness about how it was showing up, and, you know, the 360. And then it was just, I tell you, it was one of the most valuable, I think, career experiences that I've had as well. Continuing the conversation around leadership, you know, there's this concept of intentional leadership that we just talked about. There's also the concept of adaptive leadership. So I think it's very timely as well, right? And Sally and Lori have written about this in the book. So Sally, would you like to share a little bit? And Lori, you obviously add some, please, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I could talk about this forever, and I now have even more talking points. Thank you, Orly and Lacey. So I think it's a really good question. What is adaptive leadership? And as Lori and I were delving into this, drawing from our work and research, it really starts by recognizing that we as individuals and that our organizations exist in a state of dynamic non-equilibrium, which is a constant state of flux. And they know that conditions, internal, external, are never quite the same from day to day. And that changes we face are not moving us forward towards some new state of equilibrium, some new normal, more predictability and order. And they also recognize that the speed of change is requiring us to adapt in shorter and shorter time cycles, in ways that are increasingly sophisticated, and in environments that are, you know, increasingly complex and ever changing. I'm describing the world we live in. And Lori and I never came up with a succinct definition of adaptive leadership, but what we did was identify what we saw as 4 primary practices that distinguish adaptive leaders. And they're not, I wouldn't say they're the only ones, but these really rose to the surface for us. First, I think adaptive leaders really recognize that the challenges that they're facing today, the vast majority are adaptive challenges, which means they're difficult to identify. They're easy to deny, in part because of that, but also because the challenge itself is inherent in the larger system, in the whole. In other words, it's systemic, which is also a thread through our conversation. And it requires the people with the challenge to solve it, which is counter to the idea that we can bring in an expert to fix something.
Mm-hmm.
That isn't right at times, but fix it, put it back in. Basically, adaptive leaders know that transformation is a team sport, and that's another theme through here. Second, they recognize that rather than diving right into action, they need to diagnose, then act. And this means slowing down to speed up, which is not so easy in today's time. I think, especially when I think about the last couple of years, and that takes courage. So when we think about one of the attributes of adaptive leaders, it's courage. It's courage to essentially move forward and actually trust your own intuition and your own sense of what's going on. Transformational change starts with truth. And that's one of the things that is one of the aspects of secret sauce: truth, talent, and timing. And when we're talking about truth, we're talking about ground truth, not official truth. That's the inner voice of the organization, which again requires us to slow down. And being able to gain truth and take action requires perspective at 2 levels. Leaders need perspective on the organization, the context. You know, what are the mindsets? What's the culture? What's our history? What are the tensions at play? And they also need to look at themselves. What assumptions and attitudes am I bringing? What behaviors, what implicit biases am I bringing into the work? You have to be able to attend to what's going on inside of you and around you, and see the broader patterns and dynamics that are playing out. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, Sonya, it's not easy. It's not easy at all. And it takes, you know, I think about it, it's more like a marathon than a sprint. There may be aspects of it that's a sprint. An example I'll share is, and it's really coming to mind for me because it's more current, is I was engaged to work with the CHRO of a mid-market organization in the Ohio area to coach 2 members of their senior leadership team. Obviously, if coaching was needed, the relationships were negatively impacting their respective departments as well as the organization. And in in talking with the CHRO, I suggested we start with some sort of diagnostic in order to understand where to really, focus action rather than just diving in with coaching we could have done. And the diagnosis allowed me not only to verify, yeah, there are some issues here, stylistic differences, behavioral preferences, and coaching will be helpful. But what also became very apparent is that there were unresolved tensions at the organizational level, as well as sort of a prevailing sense of a lack of clarity. And in sharing this, I realized as I was kind of thinking about it, that's an adaptive challenge. The solution wasn't in the two leaders alone. The solution or the challenge is an inherent part of the system itself. So by bringing in the broader organizational perspective, the CHRO chose to lead adaptively. And I think that's another thing, that transformational change is a choice. We can choose to not do it and see how that works, as Dr. Phil says. But it's a choice. And the CHRO made that choice. So rather than treat it as a symptom, she's now positioned along with me so that we can actually look at root causes, which is redesigned the engagement. So hopefully that's a decent example. And Lori, I think you're going to talk a little bit about the other two aspects.
The other two, yes. So the other two principles of adaptive leadership are valuing and encouraging diverse views and embracing discomfort. So super important to embrace diverse views. And it's really about the ability to see the whole. And I think as leaders in organizations, there's no possible way that we can, most leaders are focused externally. And Orly talked about the complexity of the external, but you also have to be able to see internally, and you can't do that alone. And you have to tap people up and down the organization. And I think we saw this with executives during the pandemic, where there were so many divergent views around coming back to work, wearing masks, safety. And now I think we're seeing people of color and working mothers not wanting to come back, people of color uncomfortable coming back because of micro inequities, young mothers not wanting to come back because they want to be with their kids, and on and on. So I think, the truly great leaders and organizations are taking the time to really get those diverse perspectives and not be offended by them, or not be overly worried about it. And I know for myself, I don't have kids, so I have to spend a lot of time with my nieces and nephews and grad students to just really get in the mindset of younger people. I call it my millennial or my Gen Z immersions. And it takes more than one conversation, trust me, for me to really understand where they're coming from. So that's really evaluating and engaging diverse views, but also embracing discomfort. And I think Orly may have talked about this a little bit, of just the ability to get inner calm, but new ways of thinking and being really requires one to dig deep within themselves and discover not only what your strengths are, but what are your vulnerabilities. And you may have a ton of experience, but there's still so much to learn. And, there are vulnerabilities that we all have. I think one is knowing that you can't do it alone. You may be a high-level executive, you may have founded the company, you may know a ton, but there's no way you can know it all, and you can't do it alone. And you have to be willing to admit that, and admit that you don't know. And admitting it publicly only endears you to the people following you. So I suspect we're over time, Sonya, so I won't share my example.
No, we will. We have so much to talk about. Frankly, we always run out of time because there's just so much to talk about. And once we get into it, really appreciate you sharing, these specific aspects. what you meant, and again, people can read the book. I encourage everybody to do that, of course. But I really appreciate your perspective on, as this assessment, that actually Sally brought up, right? We always insist on that. We call the first phase of our process the align phase. We have this ACT process, align, connect, transform. It actually predates the book. I mean, this is 5 years ago we defined this process, and the last part of it is transform. It's T for transform. But it starts with an alignment, and the part of alignment is really a big part of it is assessing, right? Assessing and then connecting, with the drivers of the organization, so you can come up with a workplace culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. And then essential thing to that is what you mentioned, Sally, about going slow in order to go fast, right? That initial phase can't be right. You can't just skip it or accelerate it too much. Obviously, we try and do it all in the first 30 to 90 days. I mean, we try not to take months and years, but I remember this. I'm going to give you an example that's completely unrelated, but it just popped in my head. In my younger days, I mean, and even now, actually, I always wanted to be an astronaut. It's just like, to me, ever since I was a little kid, I saw the people going to the moon. I could hardly talk, I guess, and my mother said, I want to do that. I want to go to the moon. Just crazy stuff, right? So anyway, I went to NASA. I worked for NASA the first 10 years of my career. And during that time, the whole time I was I was putting in applications. I applied many times. I wasn't selected. I made it through different stages, but I didn't make it completely through. But one of the things we had to do as part of that whole process or I chose to do, was to get involved with training of the astronauts. And the astronauts, the way they train for weightlessness, part of that is in a what we call a neutral buoyancy lab, the NBL. It's basically just a big pool down at Johnson Space Center in Texas. Now, you never thought you would be talking about this stuff today, did you? So anyway, over there. So what you do is, because underwater, everybody is, obviously, you have, less weight. There's some level of weightlessness that you can experience. So I was doing that with the astronauts, and for training for that, you had to swim underwater for a very long distance. I forget the exact, but it just seemed impossible as I was standing there at one end of the pool, and they were telling me I would have to now go underwater and try and swim to the other end. I was thinking, this is totally impossible, right? And then the guy, I had been talking to this guy, who was managing the whole process, as we were preparing and others were going in. He said to me, he leaned over and he said, go as slow as you can. He said, you will think that to go faster, you'll get to the other end faster, but actually you will consume so much of, the oxygen that you've tried to, just taking a big breath, right? So it always stuck with me. And I've used this example in so many situations that people start to think I'm just talking nonsense, but then they understand the relationship, and I've seen this many times in business where just taking it a little bit slower up front, planning, assessing, and getting buy-in, is what you were talking about, right? Is talking to the others. And Lori, I want to come to your conversation about the diversity, the importance of the diversity of thought and how to manage it, to seek it and then to manage it, right? Because a lot of people seek diverse inputs and they think that's what it means to consider diverse inputs, but then you have to act upon it, or you have to at least get back with people. So for that reason, I want to maybe start also talking about the importance of sustainable DEI, for transformational change. It's actually one of the chapters in the book. And so with that, I mean, Lacey, would you like to, I know, Orly, you could talk to that, and Lacey, I mean, do you both want to talk to that a little bit about why is, and kind of following up from what Lori was just saying about diversity of thought and, inviting and then managing and incorporating that.
Orly, go ahead and jump in. I'll follow you.
Okay. Yeah, so when we think about diversity, it can be across many different lines, right? It's age, it's gender, it's culture, it's ethnicity, it's even physical disabilities. And some talk about diversity also not just as inherent, but also as acquired. For instance, living in different cultures, living across the globe, can also help you, grow those lenses. So we do see today, luckily, many more diverse senior teams. So it's definitely something that's been appreciated over the past few years. And there's been some research by McKinsey and Deloitte and many others that companies that invest in it tend to be more successful, more innovative, and more profitable. So why is that happening? And then I'll talk a little bit about my experience that comes from marketing and innovation. Well, first I want to say, personally about me, when I came to this country, I didn't realize I spoke in a different, I still speak in a different accent. For me, it was not visible at all because I came from a country that almost everyone spoke in different accents. But I was the different one. And as I grew, rose through the ranks, and sometimes people did not fully understand me. I always had to take a deep breath to understand. I need to slow down because I have an accent. So I became aware of the fact that my accent is my diversity, so to speak, and obviously coming from a different country. So people who bring, just by the very fact that people have, diverse, backgrounds, they look at things differently. So they bring what some have called cognitive diversity. They have different styles of thinking, the different ways of looking at frameworks, different ways of looking at problems, and sometimes they bring outside the box thinking. So that's very important, right? Every time we want to solve a problem, we want to bring many different lenses to that. The other thing that they found out is that when you have diverse teams, they are less likely to fall into a groupthink. A groupthink is that when people over time tend to kind of gradually drift and shift into thinking the same thing through some collective rationalization. And so obviously that's a bad thing. We don't want to move too fast to something just agree, just to get, just to feel comfortable and problem solve. When you have diverse teams, as long as there are enough of the diversity in it, you're less likely to fall into the group thing. So it's both the diverse lenses as well as less likely to be, conform and fall into groupthink. In my area of marketing innovation, before I became an executive coach, when I worked with many different companies, Fortune 100s, on new products and new solutions, I saw how diversity really helps companies bring interesting insights. Those teams that had diverse people from different cultures, different backgrounds, different ages, they brought fresh insight into ways to enter new markets. It's like they want to enter China. How do you enter China? How to maximize shopper experience? How to maximize user experience? Again, they brought different lenses, or just developing new products altogether. And I don't know how many of you, probably most of you, are familiar with Google's Aristotle project. Are you familiar with that? Google has studied their teams, like 180 real teams, to really understand what makes teams successful. Okay, so they wanted to look at the top teams and what made them successful. And they predicted in advance all kinds of things, including the makeup of the teams. What I actually found out is that the number one factor that was most important for a successful team was really the level of trust and how teams were felt comfortable to take risks and express diverse point of view. And in order to get that, it was all about value differences. Really inviting, welcoming, inviting diverse point of view, diversity in terms of all the aspects that we talked about into the group in order to inspire fresh ideas. So I think we know today, based on, many research projects, that diversity is really important for company success. We've seen companies start investing heavily in it, and I just hope that this trend grows.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to interject for a moment when you talk about the group thing. The Abilene paradox, comes. Of course, we're all taught that in MBA school. Comes to mind, where a family ends up in Abilene. It was introduced in 1970s, I guess, and nobody wanted to go there, but ended up there just because they all thought they were going along with it. So, I mean, the case for diversity has been made over and over again, but it is important, not just the diversity, but also to then leverage that diversity, right? Incorporate the diversity. It's not just have diverse people that give you inputs and you just still go
It's the
along.
inclusion part, right?
The inclusion part, yes. Go ahead, Lacey, I'm so sorry.
No, please. And you actually covered it briefly. The only thing that I would add is, when we think about all of the upside, when we think about the research, when we think about the data, and then we think about transformation, it's diversity and inclusion is important in any organization all the time. And I just think for the diversity of thought, the avoidance of groupthink, it's even more important when an organization is taking on the transformation required to adapt and change the business. It often can be thought about after we're in it, but the organizations that I've seen think about it intentionally before the transformation happen, make progress, and they make progress faster because of all of the reasons that Orly mentioned in the data and the research that we've seen from the folks like Google and McKinsey and Accenture. And people just do better work. And the sooner we recognize it, the sooner we implement it, and the sooner we're intentional to make sure it's happening all the time consistently, I think the organizations are better for it, particularly as it relates to transformation.
Yeah, and I want to recognize that, there is some data out there when people talk about, diversity, and it is true. If you have diversity, but you have dysfunction in the organization, then it can actually, those teams perform worse than homogenous, teams that all are the same, right? Or more like-minded, right? So this idea of diversity, and I was, people will, every so often, once or twice a year, somebody will send me something, what about this? We found some data. It's like, okay, great. You saw the first time I heard this. Go back and see how those teams were managed. I remember when I was the first and only woman on a public company board, and it was, and the amazing team, but then it was very different when there was, a second woman and a third person of color, and, different people of diversity. Just the dynamic changed so much and the conversation changed so much for the better. So it is important, again, to just not have, the tokenism is real, just to have one up and say, we have one woman, 1% of color, and one LGBTQ member, why aren't we? But yet, it's just, it doesn't work that way, right? It's harder than that, but it's true, and it's very important.
Yeah, it goes back to, we said that's definitely the leadership and how they're managed, but it's the trust, it's the environment that's created to allow the diversity of thought to emerge, right?
100%. I can't believe that we're almost at the end of our time. As you know, we end right on time, so we have just a couple minutes. So I want to do two things. I want to show to make sure that we have the certification codes for the credits for SHRM and HRCI. But meanwhile, I want to ask our panel to think about the one thing you would leave with our audience. Really, as part of, why should they read the book? Because I think they should. So that I've made that abundantly clear now, but it's just me saying that. Just one real reason why you think that everyone should read this book. I really think it should be taught in MBA schools. So, go ahead. Whoever wants to go first, I'll let you go. As we're showing, and we're showing the recertification credits here for the SHRM and the HRCI. But who wants to get started on the one thing you would leave with the audience?
Yeah, I'll jump in. And I would say we talked a lot about what leaders can be doing, how teams should be thinking about it. And why you should read the book is because of one of those points that I believe Lori mentioned. It is self-development. How do we think about us each moving forward and getting better and thinking differently? So read the book because it's an opportunity for you to develop, for you to think differently, and hopefully learn something new.
That's so true. Thank you.
And I can build on Lacey. It starts with you.
100%, yes.
I would say practical tips and examples for inspiration. And I'm super impressed with how well written the essays are by all of you on this panel here.
And I will say that diversity of opinions, because you have 25 different authors, as well as many interviews with, senior leaders, to really understand what it takes to make transformational change. Also, it talks about change in the individual level. It all starts there at the team level and at the organization level. So really cool book to read.
Cool writers and cool book. I totally agree with you. I couldn't agree more. Thank you again, all of you, so much. Please join us again next month. And next month, we're going to talk about Black History Month, but the title of it is Black History and Structural Racism. And we will have great speakers, and we hope that you will all join us and have a great conversation. Dr. Tiffany Ingram will be on that call, and hopefully we can have a great conversation. Send us any questions you might have. And again, thank you so much to all the panel members. This has been exceeds all my expectations, and of course I'm not surprised. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.